Okay, welcome to my second tutorial that I have decided to put up here. Yes, welcome. Okay, so today I'm going to be taking a look at texturing and compositing using the new Cycles rendering engine. This isn't the first tutorial that's out on this, there are quite a few, but there's been lots of questions flying around and people seem to want to know how to use it, so I'm going to try and clear up some of the basics. So I'm just going to come over here, and normally when you start up Blender, this is what you'll see. I've gone ahead and made quite a basic scene, and I've just gone and chopped up the default cube and done some stuff with it, added a subsurf, an edge split, and just did some fairly basic modelling here. So we've got some places where there are some curves and some straights, and if we just tick into rendered view, this is what we see. Because you're in the Blender rendering engine, which handles things completely differently, as you can see, it's very much it's very much a stacked based system, even though nodes were implemented previously. But in the new Cycles engine we do almost everything that you would want to do via nodes. So I'm just going to go ahead and tick back over to the Cycles engine, and then I'm going to go up to my window layout view up here, and I'm going to tick over into compositing. Now that gives us this lovely split windowed view, and gets rid of some of the stuff that we don't necessarily need for the task, which is useful, and I'd say that this is pretty much as good a basic setup as you could have. Ideally, if you're working in a twin screened layout, it might be good just to rip off another window using the top corner here and shift, and just drag it over to your second monitor to give you a bit more screen real estate to work with, because I tend to feel that screen real estate's very important for these tasks. Anyway, let's get stuck in and let's see what we have here and how we can do things. So once we're in the Cycles engine, there's a number of things that we can do to things. So the most basic of which is adding a shader. So up here, we also need to be in material view over here. It's very useful for assigning and deassigning various materials and textures to different parts of our meshes. So if I tick over into rendered view here and go into perspective mode with 5 on the keyboard, we can see roughly what our cube looks like with just a very flat standard cycle through these, and there are a lot of different shaders we can choose to our shader. And I'm just going to go cycle. You can quickly cycle through these on this panel, and it'll automatically set up your nodes for you. So I'm just going to go and cycle through these to see what we have. Here we have a standard glossy, then we have a glass texture, which is very similar and uses the same algorithms to the glossy, but it has some transparency mixed in, which is nice to have there as a default, so you don't have to make it with nodes yourself. Then we have translucent, which you can see is a little bit different again. We have transparent, which is very transparent. We have velvet. Now this might work a bit better if we go ahead and add some colour to this. And it gives us this kind of different, I mean, on a hard surface it's almost plasticky, but you can see when it has kind of a, when the light starts to drop off, it drops off quite a lot compared to the other textures. It's a nice one to work in. And the last one that's important for us is an emission. Now to demonstrate what an emission does, I'm just going to go into my front view, go into orthographic view, and I'm going to add a plane, go back into wireframe and rotate it by 45 degrees and scale it up a little bit. And just bring it here, and then back into perspective mode and view rendered again. So if I go ahead and create a new material, and then I go and name this lighting and change it to an emission, we can immediately see what this is doing in our scene. It's giving us scene-based lighting, which is very, very useful. Now, one of the problems with this, and one of the things that I think has caused great vexation among people just starting out with the cycles thing. So what you can do is you can go over to Object View, and then in your Object Properties panel, you have this little drop-down menu here called Ray Visibility. Now, this here allows you to assign where this particular, where the model is viewable and what it affects. Now, if we say it's, at the moment it's viewable to everything, but if we tick camera, you see where, hey, immediately it's not viewable to our camera. The strength of the light, it's still affecting our scene. And maybe just to have some visual interest, give it a reddish tint. Edit mode, we can see that it's still there, it's still editable. We can go in, subdivide it as usual. Perhaps even if we wanted, we could add some slight degree of curvature to the lighting and move it round so it's curved and acting on a corner of the scene, and go back over into rendered view. That's very useful. And I like working with lights like that quite a lot because it gives you a lot of flexibility over where the lighting is placed, and you can even have lights going off in crazy shapes and all sorts of fun stuff. So that's kind of the basics. So I'm going to go ahead and back into wireframe mode and select our primary object here. And I'm just going to, for now, I'm going to check that as glossy. And I'm going to go into rendered view again. And I'm just going to give it a slight goldy material and just up the roughness a little bit. Now the roughness is kind of, the best way I can describe the roughness value is it's a bit like a blur on the material. So if we set it all the way down to 0, it's completely glossy. And if we set it to 1, it's pretty much not glossy at all. So it's just a way of defining how much of an active shading element we have affecting go away, Vic. Affecting our model. So if we go to 0.25 for now, I think will give us a nice shiny looking texture to work with. Okay, so we know a little bit about shaders now. So what if we want to add an image to something, but still a lot simpler than it was in the old rendering engine. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down to this ground plane that I've put in here, and maybe we want our shiny cubey thing to be on a brick floor, a cobbled floor. So what we do is we go new material and call it floor. Just give it a name there. I'm generally horrible at naming conventions, but for texturing it really is necessary. Especially in Blender, as if you click here to material, it stores them in this huge list, and when you build up a project that's got like 20 or so textures in it, or sometimes more, I know that some people go up to thousands even. If they're all texture 1, 2, 3, 4, it makes it very, very difficult to know what is what. So for texturing, I know it's a pain, but you gotta use naming conventions, otherwise you'll be causing yourself a world of trouble later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a texture coordinate and an image texture here, just by going Shift A is to add, same as in object mode. Okay, so I'm just going to go and drag color to affect the color of this diffuse node we've got in here. And now here's the tricky bit. You need to drag UV down to vector. And now I'm just going to go ahead and open up a file, and I believe that the cobble texture I'm about to load is from cgtextures.com, so a shout out to them because they require a shout out. There are much better free texture packs available online, but still a shout out to CG Textures. Okay, and now if we go into here and we can just load that up in our image editor. So if we go to texture coordinate, we've got this little UV thing here. Now that requires us to have some UV coordinates. So what we need to do is we just need to tab into edit mode of this plane here. And we're in vertex select mode. So I'm just going to press A to select all, and U unwrap. And then I'm going to go back into rendered view and tab out of edit mode, and we see we've got some cobbles here, which are nice, but our cobbles are looking a bit big. So what we need to do is we need to tab back into edit mode, and we need to scale up our coordinates here. Now, really good trick when you have a texture that tiles. Pardon me. When you have a texture that tiles, if you scale up your UVs, it will scale down the texture like this. Tab in, scale it up a bit, tab out. And we've got some nice cobbles here. But that's still looking a bit bland. And it looks very flat. So you might have heard being thrown around a lot the term bump map. Now, again, another minor cause of vexation in the Cycles engine has been, how do I do a bump map? It's actually very, very simple. But it's just a bit tricky if you don't know what it's called. Because whereas in the old rendering engine, it was there on a little tick box of what you wanted the texture to affect. You could have it affect the displacement or the normals or the bump. Now, in Cycles, we don't really use normal and bump as values anymore, and we work solely from what was the displacement value. That's probably a very, very poor way of describing it because it's a new rendering engine, and just because we have names for things doesn't mean they are the same across different platforms. And I know that the way that Cycles works is a lot different to the way the old internal works. But anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go Shift Add Texture, and I'm just going to add a Verneuil texture in here, and then I'm just going to drag up from color to displacement. And then I'm not sure if you can see that or not. I can't at the moment because I don't think it's been having. That's not having so much of an effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use, say that wasn't a good method, and I'm just going to go B to border select and Shift D, and I'm going to duplicate that whole node setup. And what we're going to do is just drag it over and use it as a displacement of itself. But we don't a color ramp. And what the color ramp's going to do is it's just going to add in a little bit of control for us. It's just starting. The individual cobbles are just starting to pop out a little bit. Okay, so I think we've got how we can basically use nodes to build up something in here. But what if we want to use our nodes to affect the backdrop? Now there isn't in fact a way that we can do that by ticking over to the world editor. Now what we can do here is we could add in a texture, sky texture, and just drag over color to color. Now this gives us a node where we can just grab this ball here and we can affect what kind of time of day or night it is in our scene. And now you might be thinking, well, that's alright, but it's a bit crude, isn't it? And yeah, just doing it that way is a little bit crude. And it's not particularly, well, what we want always. So what we can do here is we can just go Shift Add a texture and add another Verneuil. And we can drag that over to say the strength of the sky. Then immediately that starts doing something quite psychedelic with our sky. But we could also add in, say, a wave texture to the intensity of our sky, which just mixes in with the Verneuil and creates some waviness. And if we change our day and night settings, we can see that it does actually keep certain things going, but we might not want I mean, this is a fun look and all, but I think it's a bit heavy on for the kind of scene that we're playing around with here. So we can do something called adding a bit of cleanup, and if we add another, wait, I'm just gonna border select these and duplicate them, and I'm just going to go and drag our output node over here, and we can add a very special kind of shader called a mix shader. Now this is possibly the most useful kind of shader, and there we can see we've mixed in, didn't do before. So what I want to do now is I want to go back to our and we can see that already on this kind of simple sky we've used quite a lot of nodes, but each node has been doing something very simple and just none of the nodes do anything that are over complex. So I'm going to go back into wireframe mode, and I'm going to select our main object and go back over here to our object nodes and say we don't want clean metal, but we're happy with this glossy shader that we've kind of set up here to work with. Let's get back into rendered view. We might want to go ahead and add a second glossy shader mixed with an image texture. Desktop, textures, metals. Now these are all just textures I've downloaded from various texture packs. I'm not sure where they came from, but yeah, if you Google for free texture packs you can find them. So I'm just going to open up this rust texture, and then I'm going to add in a mix shader. Mix shader, there you are. And behave. Nodes getting a mind of their own there. So what we need to do is, again, we need to just go back into wireframe view, tab it, and now we have this rustiness here, which is a really kind of cool rustiness, and I kind of like the rustiness this rustiness gives. I like saying rustiness too. But if we use a standard unwrap here, we get a problem, because we get, frankly, if we and this is another good thing to use, is just tick up into material view, the effect the material's having on the object in an editable space, which is good. So we have, when we unwrap things, a lot of things that we can use. So they're all kind of self-explanatory, but my favourite is UV Smart Project, which is just this tool that I've come in here, and if I press OK there, it gives us some really neat UVs that have already done quite a good job on texturing this without too much intervention. I mean, especially since we're making just a standard kind of rusty texture. So let's tick into rendered view and see how this looks. I need to line up on kind of a good surface there to work with. Then we can see that coming through, but just here we have, I failed to mention, we get a lovely way of just seeing how much each texture is affecting what's happening. And we can just duplicate these here, and I don't know why that hasn't worked without a coordinate node, but we do need to put in a coordinate node here. That's best practice anyway. And I'm just gonna get rid of that and add another texture coordinate, drag UV out to vector, and I'm just going to have this affecting the displacement, and then I'm going to add in, which you can really see on this texture now, I'm going to add an RGB to black and white, and I'm going to add a color ramp, as this gives us rather a fairly good way of affecting how much of what is affecting what and where. And I'm not liking the way that's just not liking what and immediately that's looking nicer as the light starts to come in, and it's kind of giving us a battered-ish look to the object, which is what I kind of wanted to give it. Okay, this is all well and good for the time being. But what I'm going to do now is to illustrate another problem. I'm just going to shift add a UV sphere, and then I'm going to set it smooth and give it the same material as we had before, which I think is just material because I didn't name it. Yeah, it is just material, because again I was bad on my naming conventions and then I got confused. Even I can do it. I'm the worst at the world for naming things. So let's view rendered. We need to tab in and give this some UV coordinates to work with. And there's going to be some seams on this, but anyway. So we've kind of got a ball. But what happens if we want a break in the middle of the ball and we need to use a second texture on part of our model, which is what I'm just going to go here and create. I'm just going to make a border selection, wireframe, border selection. Just get these middle 3 rows of verts here, extrude them, scale, Shift Z, scale them in slightly. And then I'm just going to go over to our modifiers and throw on an edge split, just because I like edge splits. So if we make it to perspective view and view rendered again, you can see that's giving us some good sharp edges there. But okay, so we want this middle separation here to have a different texture from the outside of our ball. So we want that as straight silver. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tab into edit mode and I'm going to go to face selection and wireframe, and I'm just going to border select these faces in the middle there. Now I'm going to add a second material by going over here and pressing this little add button, and then I'm going to click new and then click assign. Now we have the same UV mapping as for the whole ball, but we have a different node setup, which is useful. So if we go over it now into our rendered view, we can see we have a totally different texture in the middle. And one of the good things about this is if we added a texture, image texture, and then just loaded in our metal rust and drag that over to color and added input texture coordinate UV to vector, we can see that that's actually now following the same UV mapping as for the rest of the ball. So if we wanted to go in and delete that diffuse and add a glossy texture, or a glossy shader rather, we can drag over to surface and color, and we could say do something to this like add a converter RGB to black and white to the middle to give us, we can get a, found it useful to know this. When you want to go ahead and render your thing, that's quite simple as well. If you tap 0 on the keyboard, and then I'm just going to go Shift F to fly around. I like flying around, it's fun. And you want to render your texture, you should go ahead to render image, and it will render wherever the camera is placed. Now, I'm going to extend the tutorial. Important things I need to tell you about. In 2.6.4 I'm in the beta. The beta release of Blender, but this is very similar in the current stable. It's, instead of being split into sampling and light paths, it's just called integer, and these settings are crammed into one box in the current stable. But basically we can choose how much of this we're going to compute, so how many times we're going to effectively subject our JPEG to the algorithm, or whatever image output we're using. The default is 10 and 10, which is not the best. I mean, a lot of people go up to hundreds. I don't necessarily have the time for that. But we have here in light paths, we have how many number of bounces the light can have, which basically just affects how Cycle does its ray tracing. And the basic rule with all these things is the higher the number, the better. But the higher the number, the more computational power you're putting into it, so the longer it's going to take. So low is quick, high is better for these settings. And the only real thing I can say about those is have a play around, figure out what works for you. Because everyone's system is different. And if you have CUDA enabled and an NVIDIA graphics card with Cycles, you're pretty much in the money because it renders lightning fast. But I'm having to rely on CPU rendering here, so unfortunately this is not as quick as it could be. So another thing we can do is, I'm just going to go ahead and change this one here to a node editor now, and this can be output. Now we can have compositing nodes as well in Blender, and what our compositing nodes do is they basically subject our rendered image to different filters. So I think that this scene could do with a bit of lens distortion. And we could also give it, I don't know why that didn't seem to work there. I'm just going to drop in, I have messed that up. Anyway, drop in an RGB curves. Isn't working. Why is it not working? Let me try rendering it again. It has not worked. So maybe this is a bug, but normally you could go ahead and add in a load of filters there, but maybe I'll leave that to a compositing video in the future. Again, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's introduced you to some of the principles that you need to make lovely